Zhang Wei sat hunched over her desk, her fingers clattering against the keys of her laptop. It was nearing midnight, and the office was eerily quiet. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly above her, flickering every now and then like a lazy eyelash. The only other sound was the faint hum of a nearby air conditioner, struggling to keep the room cool despite the sweltering Shanghai summer. She glanced at the clock, 11:57 p.m., and let out a heavy sigh. The deadline for her project was only a few hours away, and yet her mind felt as though it had been shut off. How could anyone be expected to write marketing copy about a new coffee-flavored toothpaste when their brain was fried from months of 60-hour work weeks? It wasn't even the worst part of the job, but tonight it felt like it might break her. Why did I ever think I could get out of bed in the morning and pretend to be good at this? She muttered to herself. Her desk was cluttered with half-empty coffee cups, snack wrappers, and notes from meetings she hadn't paid attention to. She rubbed her eyes and checked her phone, noticing a string of notifications from friends begging her to join a new group chat. But she couldn't. She was stuck. Stuck in the endless loop of tasks, meetings, and expectations. And the worst part? It was only getting worse. She picked up her coffee cup, hoping for one last caffeine jolt, but it was empty. She threw it in the trash and pushed away from the desk, glancing at the row of office chairs around her. Only one person remained in the building, a fellow junior executive, Lu Wei, who was probably just as miserable. But he'd already left for the night. It was just Zhang Wei now. And silence. Maybe I should just leave. Quit the whole thing. Go to the beach. I could disappear, she said aloud, as though someone might answer. But, of course, no one did. Her thoughts wandered, as they often did, to the absurd daydreams that kept her from being completely swallowed by the soul-crushing monotony of her life. She imagined stepping away from her desk, taking a leap of faith into something totally different. She could become an artist. A musician. Hell, maybe she'd just become a nomad and travel around the world. The idea of packing up and leaving it all behind felt freeing. But that wasn't practical. Not in Shanghai. She let out a deep sigh, trying to shake off the thought of what-ifs. Then, as if in answer to her self-inflicted existential crisis, Zhang Wei's eyes fell on something unusual in the corner of the room. A small, nondescript box was half hidden behind the vending machine, an object she hadn't noticed before, though she'd been in the same room countless times. Curiosity piqued, she stood up and crossed the room. The box was no bigger than a shoebox, and there was something strangely appealing about it. As if it had just appeared there, an artifact dropped from some alternate dimension. Zhang Wei crouched down, brushed away the dust, and pulled it out. It was an odd little contraption, metal, sleek, and modern-looking, but with odd, esoteric symbols etched into its surface. A button blinked faintly in the center, like it was waiting for her to touch it. Well, this is weird, she said to herself, though it hardly registered as strange in the life she was leading. She picked it up, examining the device closely, wondering if it was some kind of promotional stunt from a tech company. After all, she worked in marketing. She'd seen her share of gadgets, both impressive and utterly useless. This one, however, felt different. There was something too purposeful about it. She glanced around, half expecting someone to jump out from behind the vending machine and declare that she'd just won some obscure contest. But, of course, no one came. Sighing, she pressed the button. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, everything froze. She blinked. The sound of the air conditioner stopped. The buzz of the fluorescent lights went silent. Zhang Wei turned, eyes wide, as she watched the motionless figure of her colleague, Lu Wei, who had been pacing earlier, now completely still in mid-step. His face was frozen in a strange half-smile, like someone had paused a YouTube video. What the hell? Zhang Wei muttered, taking a hesitant step toward him. She reached out to wave her hand in front of his face. No reaction. He was utterly still, like a mannequin. She took a deep breath, half convinced she was dreaming. Maybe exhaustion had finally taken its toll, and she was hallucinating. But the lack of noise was deafening. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the distant noise of traffic outside, everything was gone. She moved toward the door. The hallway outside the office was just as silent, its lights frozen mid-glow. Even the clock on the wall was stuck at 11:57 p.m., the same time it had been when she pressed the button. Zhang Wei's heartbeat quickened. What did I do?" she asked, the words coming out in a breathless whisper. She turned back to the device in her hand, pressing the button again. Nothing. The world remained frozen, still, suspended in time. She looked at her phone. The screen was dark, but when she tapped it, the time was still stuck at 11:57. She swiped through apps, nothing responded. She checked her messages again, only to find they were frozen in time. Her fingers swiped over the screen in vain, but it was as though the entire digital world had also come to a halt. She felt a slight panic rising in her chest, but tried to fight it. She needed to focus. There had to be some logical explanation. Okay, just breathe, she muttered to herself. She stepped out into the hallway and into the elevator, hoping that if she left the building, everything would be back to normal. She pressed the button to go down. Nothing. The elevator didn't budge. Zhang Wei leaned back against the wall, feeling a cold sweat break out on her skin. Her phone still wouldn't work. She pressed the button again, but the doors remained closed. This couldn't be real. But then, in a panic, she did something she hadn't even thought about. She pulled out the device again and pressed it one more time. This time, the effect was even stranger. The world around her didn't just freeze, everything slowed down. People were caught in the middle of movements, frozen in an agonizingly slow-motion loop. She could see the elevator doors still, but now everything around her moved in slow motion, the slight motion of her own body. The breath she drew in and out felt like molasses. It wasn't just the city, or the office, it was everything. Her own heart, her own thoughts, were stuck in this motionless space, as if they too were struggling to move forward. Her life, her plans, everything was frozen in place. Zhang Wei's mind raced as she stood in the elevator, watching the world around her move in exaggerated, slow motion. The slight shift in the elevator's floor beneath her feet seemed to last a full minute, a single movement stretching on endlessly. She had no idea what she had done or how to fix it. The button, the device, had to be the key, but pressing it again had only made things worse. The people she'd seen, those who were frozen, stuck, in mid-action, weren't just motionless, they were caught in the most bizarre, broken versions of their lives. Her colleague, Lu Wei, had been in the middle of a phone call when time had frozen. His hand was still held up, the phone dangling at an angle, but his eyes were wide and blank. The expression on his face was not just one of stillness, it was an eerie, hollow kind of freeze, like an incomplete thought caught in limbo. Zhang Wei pressed the device again, just to see what would happen. Nothing. Her breath hitched in her chest. The silence stretched on, unbearable. The only thing she could hear now was the thudding of her own heart, and even that seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. She looked down at the device in her hand, staring at the small button that had triggered the catastrophe. It seemed so innocuous, just a smooth, featureless piece of technology, but now it was a source of deep dread. A horrible, all-powerful thing. And she had activated it without thinking. The elevator doors remained shut, the world beyond it frozen. The cars on the street outside, their headlights still glaring, the pedestrians caught mid-step in the crosswalk. It was all a cruel, surreal tableau. Zhang Wei squeezed her eyes shut, forcing herself to calm down. This was not the time for panic. She needed a plan. A way to undo whatever she had done, but how? What was this device? A time machine? A prank? A hallucination? She ran her fingers along its smooth surface, scanning it for any clue, any way to reverse what had happened. There were no instructions, no warnings, just the cryptic button that had seemed harmless at first. She opened her eyes again, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on her. The world hadn't just stopped, it had frozen. It wasn't just the people who were immobilized, it was everything. Her body felt heavy, as though her own time was stalling, each breath taking too long to exhale. Her fingers trembled as she pressed the button again, this time with more force, still nothing. In frustration, she dropped the device onto the floor, her knees weak beneath her. She slumped against the wall of the elevator, her hands on her head, trying to think. Trying to breathe normally. This couldn't be real. It just couldn't. She closed her eyes again, picturing her home, her small apartment on the east side of the city. If she could just get to her apartment, she could figure this out. She could calm down, look for more information, or call someone who might know what the hell was happening, but when she opened her eyes and looked at the display again, she realized there was no way to move the elevator. The button was unresponsive, just like the rest of the world. The stillness had seeped into her own body. It was as if everything, even her own thoughts, was caught in that frozen moment. It wasn't until several long moments passed that she noticed something strange, something that made her stomach tighten with unease. A slow, creeping sensation had begun to curl in the back of her mind. Her reflection in the elevator's polished metal doors caught her eye. She had always been one to avoid mirrors, but something about the stillness made her want to look. To make sure she was real, she studied her face, her tired eyes, the fine lines beginning to form around them. The slight sag of skin at the corners of her mouth. She couldn't help but notice how old she looked all of a sudden. As if she had aged years in just a matter of minutes. And the worst part? It wasn't just her face. Her body felt off. A deep ache in her joints. Her skin, though still youthful, felt somehow more fragile. The world around her was frozen, but her own time seemed to be speeding up. No. No, 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 she whispered, her voice barely a sound in the void. She staggered out of the elevator, her legs wobbly beneath her as she entered the hallway. The office was eerily silent, just as it had been when she left. But now, it felt colder. More oppressive. The harsh fluorescent lights above buzzed in that familiar way, but they seemed muted, distant. Her footsteps echoed down the hallway as she moved toward the exit. Her eyes darted from one still figure to another, looking for anything, any sign that this could be reversed. A person who would suddenly move, a flicker of movement that might indicate the world was returning to normal, but there was nothing. Only silence and stillness. She stepped out onto the street. Shanghai, one of the busiest cities in the world, was like a ghost town. The streets were motionless. No cars honked, no buses rolled by, no street vendors shouted their prices. It was as though every second of life had been completely eradicated. Frozen in time. A deep pit formed in her stomach. She tried calling someone. Anyone. But the phone was still useless. The signal didn't exist anymore. She felt a creeping panic rise in her throat, choking her. Please, just, come back. Come back, time, come back to life, she whispered, clutching the phone, staring at the dark screen. Her breath was shallow. Her heart pounded harder. She had done something wrong. Something horrible. There had to be a way to fix it. There had to be something. The device. The button. The activation had caused this, she was certain of it now, but what was the price? Zhang Wei's legs felt weak, and she sank down onto the frozen curb. The world stretched out in front of her like a vast, still sea, unmoving, frozen forever. She closed her eyes. Maybe it was all a dream. Maybe she would wake up, and everything would be back to normal, but no. She wasn't going to wake up. She wasn't in a dream. Her phone buzzed suddenly, the first movement she had felt in what felt like hours. She jerked it to her ear, but the voice on the other end wasn't someone she recognized. The voice was cold, robotic. Zhang Wei, you must understand. There is no going back. The time has paused. You will age. You will feel every passing second. You cannot undo this. You cannot undo time. The line went dead. Zhang Wei dropped the phone, staring at it in disbelief. She felt a strange tingling sensation in her skin, as though something was changing within her. Something irreversible. She ran her hands over her face. She felt older. She looked older. Her reflection in the window of a nearby shop confirmed it. There were new lines on her face, new grays in her hair. What was happening to her? How could she be aging in a world where everything else had stopped? She had no answers. No way to reverse it. She didn't know if anyone else would ever move again. If the world would ever start up again. If she would ever wake up. And then, at that moment, it hit her like a wave of realization. This wasn't just some glitch. This was her punishment. A punishment for never appreciating time. A punishment for racing through her life, always too busy, always too focused on deadlines and success, ignoring the little moments that made life worth living. Her hand shook as she picked up the device once again, pressing the button one more time. Nothing. The device, like her, was stuck. The world was stuck. She was stuck. Zhang Wei sat on the cold curb, the weight of the world pressing down on her. She ran her fingers through her hair, feeling the strands, strangely thinner, more brittle, slip through her fingertips. The sensation of time moving without her was growing unbearable. Every passing moment felt longer than the last, stretching out like a rubber band ready to snap. The city was completely still, silent, as if it had been frozen in an endless photograph. The streets were empty, save for the occasional car, locked in place with its headlights still ablaze. Pedestrians, mid-step, were nothing but statues. The air seemed to hang in a stagnant, timeless bubble. There was no sound except the rush of her own pulse, beating loudly in her ears. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to collect herself. Her breathing was shallow, her chest tight. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. And yet, here she was, alive and moving in a world that wasn't. But why her? Why was she the one who had been chosen to endure this strange, suffocating reality? She hadn't done anything special. She had simply pressed a button, one small, stupid action. And now she was paying the price. The device had changed everything. It had taken time from her, and it wasn't going to give it back. Her phone buzzed again, the noise startling in the dead silence. She almost didn't want to answer, but there was a desperation in her chest, a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, someone had figured out what was going on. She picked it up, and once again, there was the same robotic voice on the other end. Zhang Wei, the voice intoned, chilling and emotionless. You must accept the consequences of your actions. Time has been paused. And it will continue to pass for you. The world will stay still, but you will age. She gripped the phone tighter. What do you mean? How do I stop this? How do I fix it? The voice didn't answer her question. Instead, it spoke in the same detached tone. There is no undoing what has been done. Time has shifted. You will witness the erosion of your own existence, even as everything around you remains frozen. Zhang Wei's hand shook. Please. Please, just tell me what to do. I can't live like this. Alone. Watching everyone stay the same while I age. Please. But the voice only said one more thing before the line went dead, and the phone screen faded to black in her hand. The world is paused. But your time is not. She dropped the phone to the pavement with a soft clatter, her heart pounding in her chest. It was like someone had thrown a bucket of ice water over her. Her mind swirled, spiraling into a maelstrom of confusion and terror. She had to keep moving. She couldn't just sit here. The world might have stopped, but she hadn't. There was no escaping it. She was stuck in some horrible, twisted loop where time was playing a cruel trick on her. Zhang Wei stood up, her legs shaky as she began to walk. The weight of her own body seemed heavier than it had moments ago. The world around her felt too still, too quiet. Even the city's usual noise, the chatter of people, the honking of horns, the hum of the subway trains, had been swallowed up. In its place was this suffocating silence. Her mind kept returning to one thought. The message. The voice had said it, she would age. She would feel time passing. But what would that mean? Would she wake up one morning and find that her body had aged 20 years overnight? Would her skin wrinkle before her eyes, her muscles waste away? How much time did she have left? She tried to breathe, to slow down the frantic thoughts that were piling on top of each other, one after another. But the panic was growing. She needed to get to the device. Maybe there was a way to reverse it. Maybe if she tried again. She stumbled forward, her steps uneven. The city, no, the world, was still frozen, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't. Not completely. She had to find an answer. She had to figure out how to fix this. Zhang Wei walked past the unmoving figures of the city, her eyes flicking from one frozen person to the next, each face locked in the middle of a life that had been abruptly interrupted. A group of friends stood in a circle, arms outstretched, frozen mid-laughter. A couple sat at a cafe table, their cups of coffee suspended in the air. The woman's hand was raised to her mouth, mid-sip. It was grotesque. She turned away from them, unable to bear the sight. How could everything be so still? Why hadn't anyone else noticed what had happened? She needed answers. She needed to know if there was anyone else out there, anyone at all. The office was her first destination. She had to go back. Maybe there was something she missed. Maybe the device had a hidden function, a way to fix what she had done. The building was just a few blocks away, and though the streets were empty, the long walk felt endless. She couldn't shake the feeling that her body was betraying her, like it was aging in real time while the world stood still. When she reached the office building, the door was locked. Of course it was. Why wouldn't it be? She pressed the handle, but it didn't give. She stared at it for a moment, then sighed. There had to be a way in. She turned around, looking for another entry. The glass windows reflected her image, her tired eyes, her sagging cheeks. She didn't look like the same person anymore. She looked older. Much older. The lines on her face were deeper, the wrinkles more pronounced. Her skin had lost its youthful glow. Was this the consequence? Was this what the voice had meant? Was she aging before her own eyes, a prisoner of her own desire for control? She pressed a hand to the glass, her reflection staring back at her in shock. No. She refused to believe it. It was impossible. But as the minutes dragged on, she realized the truth was undeniable. Her body was changing. She wasn't imagining it. Her reflection was aging before her eyes. She could feel it. Her muscles ached, and her joints creaked with each movement. The skin on her face felt tight and sagging. Her hair, once thick and black, now carried streaks of gray. She backed away from the window, her mind racing. She couldn't just stand there and wait for the inevitable. She had to do something. Zhang Wei spun around, determined to find the answers. The device. The catalyst. She had to fix this. There had to be a way. But as she turned back down the street, a thought began to gnaw at the back of her mind. What if there was no solution? What if she was meant to stay here, forever stuck in a world that wouldn't move while she aged, slowly and painfully, alone? She pushed the thought away. She refused to believe that. There had to be a way out of this. It was only then that she noticed something. A flicker of motion, a tiny, almost imperceptible shift in the air. She stopped. She held her breath. It was as if the world was holding its own, and then, everything began to move. At first, it was barely noticeable. A slight shudder in the air. The light above her flickered. Her phone buzzed again. The air conditioner hummed to life. Then, just as suddenly, The world jerked forward as if snapping back from an elastic band. People in the street began to move, their steps sluggish at first, as though waking from a deep sleep. The light in the windows shifted. The faint hum of the city returned. Zhang Wei stared, her eyes wide with disbelief. The world was unfreezing. The device in her hand buzzed once, as if to confirm that the flow of time was back. She stood there, frozen herself in a way, as the people around her began to stir. The hum of life returned to Shanghai, filling the space that had been silent for so long, but as the city came back to life, Zhang Wei realized something. She was no longer the person she had been. Time had passed for her, even as it hadn't for anyone else. Her body was older. She felt older, and maybe that was the real consequence of the pause. Not the frozen world, but the erosion of time that she could no longer escape. Zhang Wei looked around at the moving world. She wasn't sure what had just happened or how it was possible. But one thing was clear: time had returned, but it had never left her, and she would never take it for granted again.